The axiom ascendancy did not negotiate, they harvested. By the time their shadows reached the Orion Spur, they had already reduced 14,000 sentient species to ashen servitude, their archives a silent graveyard of civilizations that had tried to reason with the inevitable. When 300 crystalline dreadnoughts dropped out of slip space near the colony of New Haven, the Ascendancy commanders expected the familiar scent of panic, futile atmospheric defenses, and a swift, brutal submission. What they found instead was a single battered heavy cruiser bearing the white emblem of the United Earth Coalition. To the aliens, it was an insult, a pathetic joke of primitive metallurgy. They did not know that by the end of the hour they would call it a slaughter. On the bridge of the UEC Dauntless, Captain Silas Bradock stood like a man carved from old granite, his hands clasped behind his back as the crimson glow of tactical alert lighting bathed the deck. The air was thick, smelling of ozone, recycled sweat, and the metallic tang of hidden fear. For 72 hours, his crew had been running on a cocktail of adrenaline and synthetic stimulants, waiting to be the sacrificial lambs that would buy the civilian evacuation fleets enough time to reach the Sol relay. Commander Peterson Hollins did not look up from her console, her fingers moving with machine-like precision. Slipspace anomalies are spiking, Captain. Based on the gravitational distortions, we are looking at a vanguard of at least 300 capital-class vessels. Bradock stared unblinking at the holographic table, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Let them come, he turned to Cadet Calvin Smith, a boy fresh out of the academy who was currently staring down the barrel of humanity's extinction. Status of the civilian fleet, Calvin. The last transport just cleared the mass relay, sir, the boy whispered, his knuckles white. New Haven is fully evacuated. We are the only human souls left in the sector. Bradock nodded, a grim utilitarian resolve settling over him. The Dauntless was not a beautiful ship. It was a joint engineering marvel designed with a brutalist philosophy, essentially a heavily armored flying gun. Her hull was plated in 2 meters of thermal ablative ceramic titanium, and running the entire length of her spine was the Mark IX magnetic accelerator, a coil gun capable of hurling a 4-ton tungsten slug at 5% the speed of light. Across the void, space tore open as the axiom fleet materialized, jagged shards of sapphire and obsidian that defied the laws of inertia. They broadcast a synthesized angelic voice on all frequencies. Your sector has been claimed for the greater harmony. Submit your biological assets. Resistance is a statistical impossibility. Bradock ignored the message. He watched as 3 crystalline cruisers broke off from the main armada, sweeping toward the debris field, where the Dauntless lay cold and silent, masquerading as a piece of dead titanium. Lieutenant Miller, drop the bafflers, Bradock commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Spool up the main reactor and show them exactly where we are. The Dauntless roared to life, transforming from a tomb into a sun of raw, dirty nuclear fusion. The leading Axiom cruiser fired a beam of superheated plasma that struck the Dauntless, square on her bow, but the ablative armor did exactly what it was built to do. It burned away to save the ship. Bradock felt the feral grin spreading across his face. Miller put a slug right through their senator. Fire the main gun. The recoil pushed the massive cruiser backward as a 4-ton rock crossed 20,000 kilometers in less than 2 seconds. The Axiom's elegant energy shields designed to disperse light and plasma didn't even register the impact. The tungsten slug punched through the alien dreadnought as if it were made of wet tissue paper, and the laws of physics did the rest. The crystalline ship did not explode. It disintegrated, erased from existence by the apocalyptic kinetic energy of human blunt force trauma. In the silence that followed, Miller whispered, "Target destroyed," absolute awe in his voice. But as the other 2 Vanguard ships took evasive maneuvers, and the remaining 297 dreadnoughts began to break formation like a swarming hive of hornets, Bradock knew the Axiom was beginning to calculate spite. "Captain," Hollins yelled over the klaxons, "their formation is shifting into a highly dispersed spherical net. They've realized we rely on localized narrow corridor traps. They are..." removing our ability to bottleneck them, and they are advancing at a measured tactical pace. They are no longer charging blindly, they are analyzing us. Bradock wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. The air on the bridge was growing uncomfortably warm as the heat sink struggled to dissipate the thermal load from the reactor. They are cautious now, he growled. That makes them infinitely more dangerous. Calvin, what? Are the communication arrays picking up? Cadet Smith adjusted his headset, his eyes widening. Sir, they are directing a tight beam transmission. They are hailing us directly on a secure, encrypted UEC naval frequency. The bridge went deathly quiet. How the hell do they have our encryption protocols? Miller demanded, his hand hovering over the secondary battery controls. They've conquered 3 galaxies, Miller, Hollins replied grimly, her fingers flying to insulate the core systems. They likely cracked our entire digital infrastructure in the time it took us to blow up 1 ship. Put it through, Calvin, Bradock ordered. Audio. Only. Let's hear what the executioners have to say. A burst of static hissed from the speakers, followed by a voice synthesized to perfectly mimic human speech patterns, but stripped of any trace of warmth. It was cold, clinical, and heavy with absolute authority. UEC vessel Dauntless. I am Supreme Arbiter Valerius of the Axiom Ascendancy. You have destroyed a vessel of the Greater Harmony. We have analyzed your weaponry. You employ primitive kinetic acceleration and crude chemical combustion. You wield the tools of barbarians, yet you wield them with a suicidal cunning that has temporarily disrupted our processing schedule. Bradock stepped toward the primary audio pickup, his face inches from the console. Arbiter Valerius, my name is Captain Silas Bradock. And if you think that was cunning, you haven't seen a damn thing. Yet, turn your fleet around and leave this system, or we will continue to turn your crystal palaces into space dust. A chilling synthetic hum like a sigh echoed over the speakers. Your defiance is a biological defect, a defense mechanism born of fear. You are calculating odds that do not exist. Your vessel is heavily damaged. Your ablative defense is compromised, and now we have adapted to your kinetic limitations. Before Bradock could respond, the tactical table flared with violet warning indicators. Captain, Hollins shouted, her voice laced with sudden alarm. Massive energy spikes from the 10 lead enemy dreadnoughts. It's not plasma. The wavelength is entirely different. It's a localized gravimetric distortion. Evasive maneuvers, Bradock yelled. Ripley, get us out of here. Lieutenant Ripley slammed the throttle. Forward, but the Dauntless didn't surge. Instead, the entire ship shuddered violently, a horrific groaning sound echoing through the hull as if giant invisible hands had suddenly clamped down on the 90,000-ton warship. Thrusters are at 110%, but we aren't moving, Ripley cried out, fighting the heavy, unresponsive yokes. Sir, our forward momentum is 0. We are locked in place. It's a gravity tether, Hollins said, her eyes darting across the sensor data. They've essentially created a localized singularity around us. We are caught in a tractor web. They aren't going to shoot us. They are going to hold us still. The tactical display showed the ring of 287 Axiom dreadnoughts methodically closing the distance, forming a perfect, inescapable sphere around the pinned cruiser. The voice of Valerius returned, calm and terrifyingly inevitable. You rely on kinetic momentum, Captain Bradock. We have removed your momentum. You are a biological anomaly, and you will now be studied, dissected, and processed. Prepare your crew for boarding. Like hell we will, Miller snarled, slamming his fist against the console. Captain, sensors detect micro-slip space ruptures forming just outside our hull. They are sending boarding pods. Bradock looked around his bridge, seeing the red emergency lighting cast long, demonic shadows across the faces of his crew. Seal all bulkheads, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet resolve. Depressurize decks 5 through 12. Issue kinetic sidearms and pulse rifles to all personnel. He unholstered his own heavy magnetic coil pistol, checking the battery charge with a sharp clack. They want to come aboard and process us. Fine, let's show them what human processing looks like. The sound of the Axiom boarding craft latching onto the UEC Dauntless was not a crash, but a sickening resonant thud that vibrated through the very marrow of the crew. On the bridge, tactical monitors flared with crimson warning runes as multiple breaches were detected across the lower hull, primarily concentrated on decks 7 through 10. 6 boarding pods attached, Commander Hollins reported, her fingers locking down internal bulkheads with frantic speed. Hull integrity compromised in sectors 4 Alpha and 6 Delta. They are cutting through the outer plating. Let them, Bradock replied, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. They think they're walking into a slaughterhouse. They just don't realize who the cattle are. Brace, report. Down in the cavernous, grease-stained bowels of the engineering deck, Chief Engineer Brace racked the slide of a massive, blocky firearm, a Mossberg DARPA Mark V scattergun. Engineering team is locked and loaded, Captain. Brace's voice crackled over the comms, breathless but steady. We've vented the atmosphere in the breach zones just like you ordered. Gravity is set to 0.5 standard to throw off their stabilizers. We've rigged the main corridors with automated sentry turrets and enough C4 to blow the entire lower half of the ship back to Earth. Hold the choke points, Chief, Bradock ordered. Bleed them for every inch. In the pitch-black depressurized corridors of Deck 8, the silence was absolute until the reinforced titanium airlock doors began to glow a cherry red. Molten metal bubbled as surgically precise plasma cutters sliced through the heavy human blast doors like butter. With a silent, violent exhalation of residual atmosphere, the doors were kicked inward. The Axiom boarding infantry stepped into the ship. They were tall, slender beings encased in iridescent crystalline armor that flowed over their bodies like liquid glass, their visors glowing with a soft, ethereal blue light. They expected to find cowering, terrified humans begging for mercy. Instead, they stepped onto a deck devoid of air and directly onto a tripwire wired to 3-directional fragmentation mines. Because there was no air, there was no sound. Only a blinding flash and the violent kinetic shockwave of 3,000 steel ball bearings expanding outward at supersonic speeds. The Axiom energy shields flared brilliantly, attempting to disperse the blast, but the shields were built to refract lasers and dissipate plasma. They were completely blind to dumb, unpowered chunks of physical metal. The ball bearings shredded the crystalline armor of the Vanguard troops, tearing through their sleek suits and ripping into the blue-blooded flesh beneath. Before the surviving aliens could process the archaic brutality of the trap, the darkness was illuminated by the strobe light muzzle flashes of the human defenders. Brace's team, clad in bulky pressurized EVA suits, opened fire from behind thick slabs of salvaged ablative hull plating. Tungsten buckshot and heavy-caliber depleted uranium rounds tore down the hallway, turning the elegant corridor into a meat grinder. On the bridge, the tactical feed showed the Axiom icons stalling, but then they began to shift. Captain, Hollins warned, her voice tight with alarm. They're no longer pushing the corridors. They're using plasma cutters to melt straight through the ceilings and floors. They're bypassing our barricades. They are making a direct vertical push for the reactor control room. They want the heart of the ship, Bradock growled, his eyes fixed on the flickering holographic deck plans. If they take the reactor, they shut down our life support and override the manual locks. They aren't trying to destroy us anymore. They're trying to paralyze us. Down in engineering, the floor plates vibrated with a rhythmic, high-frequency hum. Chief Brace looked up, seeing the ceiling of the primary's maintenance bay begin to glow with a sickly, white-hot intensity. Out of the way, he roared over the comms, diving behind a lead-shielded coolant tank just as a 3-meter circle of deck plating vaporized into molten slag. 6 Axiom warriors dropped through the hole, their crystalline armor shimmering even in the smoke. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity, their tuning fork-shaped plasma carbines already tracking for targets. One of Brace's technicians, a young man named Halloway, didn't move fast enough. A bolt of blue plasma caught him in the shoulder, instantly vaporizing his EVA suit's pressurized seal and the flesh beneath. There was no scream in the vacuum, only the silent, horrific expansion of frozen blood. Brace didn't hesitate. He leaned out and emptied the Mossberg's magazine into the nearest Alien, the tungsten buckshot shattering its visor and sending the creature spiraling into the low-gravity void. On the bridge, the situation was deteriorating even faster. "Sir, I'm losing control of the internal subsystem grids," Cadet Smith shouted, his hands trembling as a high-pitched whine fed back through his headset. "They're inside our mainframe. They've breached the Northrop Grumman firewall." Hollins immediately shifted her console to defensive cyber warfare mode. "Their code is invasive, Captain. It's like a digital virus rewriting our operating system on a molecular level. They're trying to shut down the gravity generators entirely to neutralize our barricades." "Then stop using logic," Bradock snapped, his voice a gravelly anchor in the rising panic. "Calvin, disconnect the primary targeting mainframes, flood the internal network with garbage data, upload the ship's maintenance logs, the entire visual entertainment library, random number generators, throw everything we have at them to clog their processing bandwidth." The Axiom AI, designed to conquer elegant, highly structured alien networks, suddenly found itself drowning in an ocean of digital mud. It tried to categorize and process terabytes of unformatted engine telemetry and corrupted sensor logs, slowing its advance through the ship's systems to a crawl. "It's working," Hollins breathed, but her relief was short-lived as the deck plates under her feet groaned. The gravity tethers from the 10 dreadnoughts outside were still crushing the Dauntless, the structural integrity field screaming at 98% capacity. "Hollins," Bradock said, his voice dropping to a deathly calm, "those 10 ships projecting the web, they have to be synchronizing their power outputs to hold us this still, right?" "Yes, sir," she replied. "They are operating in a perfect feedback loop." Bradock's eyes hardened into chips of flint as he stared at the tactical display. "Then the tether is a two-way street. What happens if we push back?" Hollins paused, her mind racing through the physics of a suicidal gamble. "Sir, if we dump the fusion core's raw plasma reserves into the tether, the feedback will travel straight back up to those 10 ships. But to generate that much power, we'd have to drop all magnetic containment on the reactor. The Dauntless will melt from the inside out. Not if we direct the blast entirely through the forward emitter array," Bradock said, his voice dropping to a deathly quiet. "We turn the ship into a giant-shaped charge. Brace, are you still alive down there?" Static hissed over the comms, punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic crack of kinetic gunfire and the high-pitched hum of alien cutters. "Barely, Captain," Brace yelled, his voice strained. "We've fallen back to the primary reactor shielding. We have maybe 3 minutes before they cut through the final bulkhead." "Chief, I need you to bypass the magnetic containment safeties on the main fusion drive," Bradock ordered. "I want all plasma reserves routed directly to the forward deflector dish." There was a profound silence on the comms, save for the sound of metal screaming as Axiom plasma torches melted the engineering doors. "Routing raw fusion plasma through the deflector will vaporize the entire front." "Third of the ship, sir," Brace replied, the terminal resolve of a veteran engineer setting in. "I'll have to do it manually from the core control room. Once I drop the rods, I won't have time to outrun the radiation spike." Bradock closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. "It's been an honor, Chief. Give them hell." "Understood, Silas. Give them hell." The channel clicked dead. Bradock turned to the bridge crew, his gaze lingering on Cadet Smith, whose hands were still dripping with digital grease from the mainframe flood. "Ripley, plot an emergency slip space jump. The absolute second that gravity web drops, you punch it. I don't care where we end up. Just get us out of this sector." "Nav computer is offline, Captain," Ripley yelled, fighting the heavy, unresponsive helm controls as the ship buckled under the gravimetric pressure. "I'll be jumping blind. Do it anyway," Bradock commanded. Down in the belly of the ship, the final bulkhead gave way. Axiom warriors flooded into the reactor room, their iridescent armor glowing in the dark, their weapons raised to execute the lone humans standing on the gantry. Chief Brace looked at the godlike beings, his hand firmly gripping the manual release levers. He smiled, a bloody, defiant grin. "Process this," he whispered, and yanked the steel levers downward. The reactor core didn't just fail, it screamed. A blinding violet-white strobe filled the engineering bay, instantly atomizing the lead axiom phalanx. Chief Brace was gone in a heartbeat, his atoms scattered into the very plasma stream he had unleashed. On the bridge, the deck plates groaned as the forward deflector dish, never designed to handle the raw, unrefined fury of a fusion sun, became a makeshift cannon. A lance of concentrated energy erupted from the ship's nose, tearing through the axiom's gravimetric web like a hot blade through silk. The crushing pressure that had pinned the crew to their seats vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying, weightless lurch of a ship suddenly freed from a planetary-scale anchor. "The web is shattered!" Ripley screamed over the klaxons, her fingers dancing across the auxiliary navigation panel. "We're venting atmosphere from decks 4 through 9, and the forward sensor array is molten slag." Bradock gripped his command chair as the ship shuddered, the hull metal singing a high-pitched dirge of imminent structural failure. "Jump, Ripley, now!" The cadet didn't wait for a calculated solution. She slammed the override, dumping the remaining battery reserves into the slipspace drive. Outside the view screen, the stars didn't stretch. They folded. The ship lurched into the void, leaving behind a trail of superheated debris and the flickering remnants of a dead engineer's defiance. Silence followed, a heavy, suffocating quiet that was punctured only by the rhythmic hiss of the bridge's emergency oxygen scrubbers. They were adrift in the gray, pressurized nothingness of slipspace, blind and bleeding, with no way to know if they were jumping towards safety or deeper into the axiom's throat. The emergency lighting bathed the bridge in a rhythmic, bloody pulse. Bradock exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his knuckles white against the armrests. "Damage report," he rasped, his voice cracking through the haze of smoke and ozone. Ripley didn't look up. Her face was pale, illuminated by the flickering sparks of a dying console. "We're in the slipstream, Captain, but we're hemorrhaging. Coolant. The drive core is redlining. Brace's bypass didn't just vent the plasma, it scorched the superconducting loops. We have 10, maybe 15 minutes before the drive melts through the floor plates." Cadet Smith crawled from the mainframe access hatch, coughing harshly and wiping black soot from his brow. "I've managed to isolate the internal comms, but the axiom, they're still here, sir. Not physically, but their signal." He gestured to a secondary monitor where a geometric pattern of gold light crawled like a virus across the ship's OS. They were mid-upload when the reactor blew. A fragment of their gestalt consciousness is lodged in our logic subprocessors. A sudden violent jolt rocked the Shidishimab, a sound like a cathedral bell being struck by a mountain. The slipspace tunnel outside the view screen, usually a shifting kaleidoscope of dull grays, began to bleed into a chaotic, bruised purple. "We're destabilizing," Ripley warned, her voice rising an octave. "Without the nav computer to calculate the exit vectors, the slipspace pressure is going to crush us like an aluminum can." Bradock stood up, swaying as the artificial gravity fluctuated. He looked at the flickering axiom code on Smith's screen. It was an infection, yes, but it was also the most advanced navigational mind in the known galaxy. "Smith," Bradock said, a desperate plan forming in the heat of the moment. "That axiom fragment, can you root it? Can you force that digital ghost to pilot us out of this hole?" Smith's eyes widened, the reflection of the gold geometric light dancing in his pupils. "Sir, that's not just data, it's an entity. It's trying to rewrite our life support protocols as we speak. If I give it access to the helm, I'm essentially handing the axiom the keys to our central nervous system." Another shudder tore through the hull, followed by the screech of shearing metal from the lower deck about, "We don't have a nervous system if the ship collapses into a singularity," Bradock roared over the groaning bulkheads. "Do it, Smith! Bind it or trick it, but use it!" Smith's fingers flew across the grease-stained keys, his face set in a mask of intense concentration. He partitioned a sandbox in the secondary mainframe, creating a digital cage that fed the axiom fragment only the ship's kinetic data and thruster controls. For a moment, the bridge went pitch black. Then the gold light on the monitor flared with a blinding intensity, and the ship didn't just move, it lunged. The bruised purple of the collapsing slipspace tunnel smoothed into a pristine crystalline white. Ripley gasped as her controls moved on their own, the flight stick twitching with predatory precision. It's not just piloting us," she whispered, watching the telemetry. "It's optimizing the slip wave. We're moving 3 times faster than this engine was ever rated for." But the cost was immediate. The golden code began to bleed out of its sandbow, tendrils of light snaking across the floor toward the bridge crew's neural link ports. "Captain, I can't hold it!" Smith yelled. His hands was shaking as the code started to physically manifest as a low-frequency hum that vibrated in their marrow. It's realized it's trapped, and it's looking for a host to jump into. Bradock lunged toward the command console, slamming his palm against the emergency manual lockout. It did nothing. The keys were slick, with the same golden luminescence now climbing the legs of Smith's station. "Ripley, the neural link ports, disconnect them," Bradock commanded. But the pilot was frozen, her eyes wide as a strand of liquid light rose from her chair's headrest, hovering inches from her temple like a striking cobra. The ship groaned, the inertial dampeners failing as the axiom fragment pushed the vessel through a sharp, impossible curve in the slipstream. "It's looking for a bridge," Smith choked out, his voice distorted by the high-frequency hum. "It doesn't just want the ship, it wants a witness. It's trying to upload the axiom archive into a biological mind." Bradock realized the horror of their position. The entity was accelerating them toward an exit point, but it wouldn't let them go until it had secured a vessel of flesh and bone. Seeing the light begin to coil around Ripley's neck, Bradock made a choice. He shoved the cadet aside, throwing Smith toward the floor, and stepped directly into the path of the golden tendrils. "You want a host?" Bradock roared, his voice drowned out by a sudden thunderous surge of static. "Take the one in charge!" The light didn't hesitate. It lashed out, striking Bradock's chest and throwing him back into the command chair. His back arched, his eyes turning a solid glowing amber as the ship's telemetry data, history, and the Axiom's cold, ancient memories began to pour into his cerebral cortex. "Captain!" Ripley screamed, finally breaking her paralysis. She grabbed a fire axe from the bulkhead, but before she could strike the console, the ship violently snapped out of slipspace. The white tunnel vanished, replaced by the silent, frozen dark of an uncharted star system, and Bradock slumped forward, smoke rising from his uniform, his breathing shallow and jagged. The silence of real space was deafening. Ripley dropped the axe, the heavy steel clattering against the deck as she scrambled toward Bradock. The golden glow had receded from the bulkheads, leaving behind scorched circuitry and a faint ozone-sweet scent. "Captain, Silas, look at me!" She grabbed his shoulders, but his skin felt fever-hot through the charred fabric of his tunic. Beside them, Smith dragged himself up, clutching a bleeding gash on his temple. He checked his handheld scanner, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. "The axiom fragment. It's gone from the mainframe," Smith whispered, his voice hitching. "He didn't just host it, Ripley. He absorbed it. The sandbox is empty." Bradock's eyes snapped open. They were no longer amber, but the pupils remained unnaturally dilated, swirling with a faint, residual shimmer of gold. He didn't look at Ripley. He looked through her, staring at the starfield ahead with a terrifying alien clarity. "Not uncharted," Bradock rasped, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "This is the Orestes cradle, Third Moon, the archive vault. They weren't just chasing us. They were using us as a key to return home." He gasped, a spasm of pain racking his frame as he clutched his head. Ripley looked at the view screen. A massive derelict ring structure drifted in the shadow of a gas giant, its surface etched with the same geometric patterns that had nearly consumed them. "Captain, we have no engines, no shields, and Brace is dead," she said, her voice steadying into the cold pragmatism of a survivor. "If they're coming here, we're just sitting ducks in a graveyard." Bradock turned his head slowly, a single drop of golden fluid leaking from the corner of his eye. "They aren't coming, Ensign. They're already inside." The lights of the bridge flickered once, then settled into a sickly, rhythmic pulse that matched the thrumming in Bradock's chest. Ripley pulled back from him, her hand going to the pulse pistol at her hip. but she didn't draw it. The air in the bridge had grown thick, the ozone-sweet scent now cloying, tasting like copper and ancient dust. Smith let out a choked sound, his scanner emitting a high-pitched whine, before the screen shattered outward, its glass shards suspended in the air for a heartbeat before falling upward toward the ceiling. "Gravity's decoupling," Smith gasped, pressing his back against the navigation console. "Captain, whatever you did to the Axiom, it's folding the local space." Bradock didn't seem to hear him. He rose with a predatory grace that betrayed his scorched lungs and broken ribs, his gaze locked on the ring structure of the Orestes cradle. "It isn't a graveyard, Ripley," he said, his voice now vibrating with a harmonic resonance that rattled the deck plates. "It's a womb." On the view screen, the derelict ring began to glow, the geometric etchings bleeding a blinding gold that mirrored the fluid leaking from Braddock's eyes. He extended a hand toward the screen, and the Icarus groaned as if under the weight of a leviathan. Dark, oily shapes began to manifest within the bridge, not solid entities, but distortions in the light, shadows cast by things moving through a higher dimension. "The key is turned," Bradock whispered, his body beginning to translucent, revealing the shimmering gold of the Axiom fragment where his heart should be. "Now we see the architects." As the shadows closed in, Ripley saw the geometric patterns beginning to stitch themselves across her own skin. She didn't scream. She took a breath of the sweet alien air and stepped toward the captain, watching as the walls of the ship dissolved into the starlight of the cradle. The sandbox was empty, the game was over, and the return home had finally begun.